Yes, hello everyone. Thank you for joining us for this UEBT series of digital dialogue. It's the second webinar on access and benefits sharing. And I wish to Yes, hello. So I think there was an issue with this sound. So again, let me welcome you to this second ABS webinar as part of our UEBT Digital Dialogues series. I wish to thank our sponsors, which you see on the screen, which are supporting us in organizing these webinars. And in particular, the ABS Capacity Development, who is co-organizing this webinar with us today on access and benefit sharing. My name is Valérie Normand. I am working with UEBT as a senior ABS expert. Previously, I was working with the CBD Secretariat for many years on the issue of access and benefit sharing. So I'm happy to let you know that there are many of you with us today. So thank you very much for joining us. This webinar will be 90 minutes. So now I would like to move to the next slide. So on this next slide, you see our speakers for today. So thank you very much for joining us, speakers. We look forward to hearing more from you in just a few minutes. So those of you who followed our first ABS webinar a couple of weeks ago will remember that we looked back at 10 years of the Nagoya Protocol and its implementation, given we just celebrated 10 years since the adoption of the protocol in 2010. Now, this dialogue today will be looking forward at access and benefit sharing beyond 2020. So we will have three segments. Our first segment will look at international policy developments and in particular ongoing work for the development of a post-2020 global biodiversity framework, which will be adopted in 2021 in China at the UN Biodiversity Conference. So we will hear more about that and of course about more specifically what is the ABS dimension of this framework. Then we will move to the second segment, which is more about ABS implementation. And during that segment, we will hear about ongoing ABS projects and how they have been addressing access and benefit sharing. And importantly, I would say, what are some lessons from these projects that can help to inform future ABS implementation? And finally, we will have three commenters which will be sharing their views in terms of what they see as key ABS issues for the future from both a business and a country perspective. So thank you very much again for being here. And now we can already go to our first segment. And next slide, thank you. And now I would invite Taoko Shikongo to present. Taoko is the Senior Program Officer, Head of the Nagoya Protocol Unit at the Secretariat of the CBD. And Taoko will be telling us more about the process underway for the adoption of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework and how it addresses access and benefit sharing. So Taoko, I invite you to turn on your camera and to go ahead with your presentation.
Thank you, Valerie. May I have my presentation?
Yes, it's on the screen now.
Thank you, thank you. Good afternoon, colleagues, everybody. I was introduced. Can we go to the next slide? So the quick questions that I will be addressing today is to look at what are the emerging issues at the policy level and priorities as well as the implementation level. Then I'll move on to look at what are these opportunities for engagement for the private sector. Next one. In terms of the current emerging issues, we have today the 2020 biodiversity And the year 2020 is actually marking a very critical year for biodiversity, because it is when the 2011-2020 strategic framework for biodiversity and its 80 targets will expire. These were agreed in Nagoya in 2020. And what is now happening is we're asking ourselves what happens now when this comes to an end. And the Conference of the Parties in Egypt, in COP14, adopted a number of decisions that are relevant to the post-2020 biodiversity framework. And this framework is to develop goals, targets, and indicators to look at the measurable implications at the global and national level for biodiversity. What can we work towards? And they also had decision 14/1, which asked us to assess progress towards the selected Aichi biodiversity targets and options to accelerate their progress if we do not achieve them by now. And in decision 14/34, they asked for a comprehensive and participatory process for the preparation of the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. And so it also, in decision 14/31, asked for enhancing integration under the convention and its protocols with respect to the provisions related to biosafety and ABS. In this decision, the COP encouraged parties to consider further integration of ABS into other areas of work under the convention as part of discussions on the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. And there are issues that come up for consideration, whether this framework will address the objectives of the CBD in a balanced way. And since the ABS is, some parties are not part of the CBD, or well, let me rather say some CBD parties are not party to the Nagoya Protocol. And what will that mean for them since this framework is at the international level? May I have the next slide? And so one has to look at the link between ABS and another topical issue that comes up, which I'll discuss just now, is DSI, Digital Sequence Information, and the post-2020 biodiversity framework. And to discuss this link, I'll first look at what is ABS. Next slide. And then look at what is DSI and what are the linkages. In terms of the Nagoya Protocol, it's to address the three objectives of the convention, which is one, access to genetic resources and the exchange of that access. And it must lead to the fair and equitable sharing of benefits derived from their utilization. And all two of those will then contribute to conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. However, it is the benefits that must become the incentive for conservation. Next. With regard to digital sequence information, the issue of digital sequence information on genetic resources was first raised at COP13 and COP2 in Cancun, Mexico in 2016. The parties decided to consider at their next respective meetings any potential implications of the use of this information for the objectives of the CBD and the Nagoya Protocol. At this point, one has to highlight that the term digital sequence information, or DSI, does not have an internationally agreed meaning, and it is just used as a placeholder until there is more clarity on the concept and scope. Then more appropriate terminology could be developed. In decision 14/20, parties recognize the importance of DSI on genetic resources for the three objectives of the convention, which are mutually supportive, and that access to and use of DSI on genetic resources contributes to scientific research, as well as to other non-commercial and commercial activities. It was also recognized that further capacity to access, use, generate, and analyze DSI is needed in many countries. However, there is a divergence of views amongst many parties regarding benefit sharing arising from the use of DSI. And within the slide, the three major ones that are emerging is the question whether genetic resources in the CBD cover DSI or not, and whether DSI should fall under the Nagoya Protocol, and whether open access to DSI can be regarded as a sufficient form of benefit sharing. The issue relates to the increasing speed and falling cost of sequencing, which have resulted in an enormous quantity of biological data being produced and stored in publicly accessible databanks, which are used for research and development, including for commercial purposes. This happens in the absence of benefit sharing obligations, and many parties and other actors are concerned that this will negatively impact on the third objective of the CBD and the objective of the Nagoya Protocol. Others are concerned that imposing access and benefit sharing obligations on DSI, on genetic resources, will have a negative impact on open access to information for research, including for conservation and sustainable use. Next slide. So to bring all of this together, we have a roadmap towards COP15. And in this, we will look, we started already in February to June 2019 to get views on the matter. And these were then peer-reviewed in October to December 2019. And it went to an ARTEC on DSI in March 2020. And then the outcomes of that will be discussed in the open-ended working group to be determined next year, around the first quarter. And these recommendations will then go to the COP sometimes in next year. And from the Secretariat, we've got information sharing webinars on DSI. The first one will be on 1st December 2020, and it is to understand DSI, the concepts and what it is all about. And then on the 9th of December, we'll have a look at what is the science of of DSI under the CBD, taking or drawing from the report from the ARTEC or the ad hoc technical expert group. And then in the first quarter of next year, we'll have a look at the policy options for ABS and DSI as it emanates from the ongoing discussions. Next slide. And so what is the opportunity for the private sector in all of this? And the question that comes to mind is we have to ask ourselves, what is the interest of parties and out of the private sector? What partnerships can evolve between private sector and academia, private sector and indigenous people, and local communities, private sector and governments with regard to ABS and DSI? What can we do to build trust amongst ourselves and lower transaction costs for all? Because there are some private sector members who have actually been doing very well, but there are others who have not been doing very well. And the measures that are out there for ABS may not always be easy to implement because these are developed in partnership with all stakeholders. But when it comes to the regulations, these are developed by parties, and sometimes these regulations may not be very easy to implement. Then let's look at the role of private sector involvement in informing the development of national legislation, because it becomes very important for the private sector to actually put their issues and interests forth in the development of these legislations as well as the regulations. And the private sector needs to better understand the protocol's provisions and opportunities and challenges arising from its obligations. And then there is the big question about the private sector and these communities. What do we do with regard to this? There are some instruments out there, there are some initiatives out there that provide models of how this relationship can be established and maintained so that the benefits can be shared equally amongst all the players so that we can have the ABS that we want or that we need. Next slide. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tauko. Thank you for presenting an overview of the process leading to the adoption of the post-2020 framework. We know that this is quite a process involving several meetings, also consultations with stakeholders. So although it is a government-led process, there have been many opportunities for stakeholders to provide input. Given this global biodiversity framework, when it is adopted, will have to be supported not only by government, but by stakeholders who support the implementation of the objectives of the CBD. So there will be an opportunity for questions and answers after each of our segments. So you can, if you like, if you already have some questions, I invite participants to include these questions in the question and answer box. So we will not be using the chat for this, but the question and answer box. So you can already ask your questions. We will, however, now go to the second presentation under this segment dealing with the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. And we will address questions, as many as we can, following the presentation by Suhail Al-Janabi. So Suhail is the co-manager of the ABS Capacity Development Initiative, and he will be speaking more now about the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework and how specifically it addresses access and benefit sharing in terms of targets that have been developed and also indicators which will help to monitor the impact of ABS in the future. So Suhail, I invite you to turn on your camera and to please go ahead with your presentation.
Yes, good afternoon, Valerie, Sam, and colleagues listening to this presentation. Whereas Dr. Shikongo has more provided an overview of the process and, let's say, the construction of the entire box, I would like to invite you now to have a look with me in that box, and in particular the discussions now on the benefit sharing goals and their impacts, the indicators, to so to speak, to have a little snapshot on the post-2020 framework discussions. Next slide, please. We are not starting from scratch. There were some of these open-ended working groups that have discussed the architecture, so to speak, of this post-2020 framework of the CBD. And that all should then lead to that, to the realization of the vision 2050 that has been adopted in Nagoya 10 years ago, is living in harmony with nature. But for that, of course, you would need to split and decorticate a little bit into tools and different goals. So for the post-2020 framework, and in particular for the period 2020 to 2030, what we see is that we have milestones and goals now defined with respect to ecosystems and species and genetic diversity. So this is the conservation package, so to speak. There is the package related to human needs. So how can biodiversity contribute to human needs? Then what interests us, of course, a lot is the equitable sharing of benefit. And then, of course, you would need to have a toolbox with means of implementation. And we'll have a closer look at that in a second. On the next slide, please. So this 2030 mission to take urgent action across society to put biodiversity on a path to recovery for the benefit of planet and people, I think this is something we can all subscribe to. But here, of course, one needs to have an operational approach and has to set targets. Next, please. So there are 4 goals next that are looking at these 4 elements. So it's on ecosystem, species, and genetic diversity, on connectivity of ecosystems, but it's also, of course, that the threat on biodiversity is reduced. I mentioned the impact on human needs. So this is then that nature is contributing to human well-being and that it's also valued. We have the means of implementation, goal D. So that capacity building and also the right instruments are in place. And we have that which is then highlighted in red. These are now the goals relating to access and benefit sharing. So it is twofold. One is looking at the operationability of the system so that access and benefit sharing mechanisms are established in all countries. This reminds us on IG target 16, which was also on the, that legal frameworks are in place and that the Nagoya Protocol is ratified. So of the IG targets that have been developed in Nagoya 10 years ago. But there's of course no more an impact indicator or an impact objective that benefits that are shared are increased, and of course by an amount that is still to be discussed and fixed. What we're looking at now is not the final version, but it is the current status of discussion of the zero draft of this post-2020 framework. Next. To provide you a little bit of an overview what we see in the different goals, I mean, on the reducing threats to biodiversity, here you see all the different aspects that are relevant for biodiversity, invasive species, protected areas, linkages to climate change. So to all those, there are no specific goals and indicators being elaborated. Same to meeting people's needs, air quality, agrobiodiversity, then also relationships to wild species, and then of course if you look at the tools and solutions for some for implementation and mainstreaming, there's a question to adverse impacts of biotechnology. It's on subsidies that are to be eliminated. So quite a mouthful of really relevant aspects. But there's one, number 12 next, which is on the utilization of genetic resources and associated traditional knowledge. Next, please. So how is the current status of discussion? If we look at target 12, and it says that by 2030, an increase of benefits, here we still discuss, is it percentual or is it a specific figure, benefits shared for the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity through ensuring access to and the fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from the utilization of genetic resources and traditional knowledge. That reads fine, but there's a lot of devil in the detail, which I think merits also input from industry and other stakeholders. Next, please. So it is focusing on impact because no tree will be conserved or replanted just by legal systems in place. So it is right, I think, that one is looking at what is then coming out of benefit sharing agreements and how that it is contributing to the conservation of and sustainable use of biodiversity. But questions are, of course, if we talk about increase of benefits shared, there, of course, that is I think in particular for industry an interesting thing, because that can only be measured if we had an idea of the benefit sharing payments that are then transferred from providers, from users to providers, and which are usually confidential and not being reported to official authorities. So there, of course, is a problem with the baseline. So where are we standing now? And also there is a problem of measuring it, because even if it was known to the competent national authorities, what percentage, for example, was agreed, it's still a question. If it was then over 10 years, for example, the annual turnovers will not be made, of course, public. So how can we measure that? Then, of course, the form. We are talking about monetary, non-monetary benefits. How can we link that to the target? Then there is, of course, the use, as we see here, is ensuring that this is shared for the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. So how can we monitor that this is indeed then contributing to conservation and sustainable use, be it financially or through capacity building? And then there is the equitable sharing of benefits. And we do see that, of course, many are saying that a more fair consideration of indigenous people, local communities, TK holders, and women should be attained. Next. So these are some of my or the initiative's considerations when looking at their targets, and it contains everything that it needs, or a lot of what it could need, but there are, of course, some further suggestions and comments from the last round of the peer review of the zero draft. There were also considerations to measure, for example, the number of legal frameworks that are in place, but which is a nice indicator, but what would it tell us? Because it does not necessarily recur to benefits shared and to the impact. And some also say that there is quite some bureaucracy coming alongside with that. Others are considering to measure the number of prior informed consent, mutually agreed terms, and internationally recognized certificate. But here we have then, of course, that some countries are not requiring PIC, for example, but there are benefit sharing is happening, although there are other options of regulation, so this would not be counted here. Then there is and I'm referring now to many of the suggestions coming in the peer review, that the number of agreed cases of access and benefit sharing should be monitored, because here we would also cover countries that have no regulations, and because at the end of the day, benefit sharing is what it counts, and to get an indication of the potential of benefit of genetic resources, there are also considerations to or suggestions to monitor innovation and utilizations. All this, of course, has to be seen in the context of what are the data that might be available and provided by whom. In order to ensure transparencies, there are voices that data should be disaggregated to sex, age, ethnicity, which of course will raise some challenges. Others say that we should also monitor compliance by checkpoint communiques, or even count biopiracy cases, just referring now to some of the suggestions coming in. And then there is the overall question of if we would then count benefits sharing the increase, would that be only under the Nagoya Protocol, or would that also include, for example, benefit sharing, which is then under the International Treaty for Food and Agriculture, under the World Health Organization framework for pandemic influenza, or even broader, that is recommended, benefit sharing being recommended under the UNCTAD principles and criteria. So this is just to give you a snapshot on where the status of discussion is. And I think next that this is now a very good moment in time also for industry to reflect on what is meaningful on the one hand and what is measurable on the other hand, and workable at the end of the day. With that, I think that was quite a mouthful, and hope that I didn't confuse you too much. Thanks a lot.
Yes, thank you very much, Suhail. No, I think that was very useful. Of course, you know, these are complex issues. There is a lot happening in this process. So of course, it is a challenge to address all of that in 10 minutes, but thank you very much for that useful overview. So we have already received some questions. I will ask Tauko to also turn his camera on. And Suhail, please keep your camera on also for the question and answer period. Wonderful, thank you. So thank you to both of you for this information you shared with us on developments on the post-2020 framework. So it is a challenging process. There is still a lot to be addressed until the adoption of the framework next year in 2021, hopefully in May of 2021. Now, one question for you, Tauko, a very technical question. In your slides, you mentioned the details of information sessions that will be held in December on digital sequence information. Can you tell participants where this information on these information sessions is available, and also whether it's open to all participants or whether this is only for governments?
Currently, we are busy celebrating the 10 years of existence of the Nagoya Protocol, which we started on the 29th. And every Wednesday, we'll have a series of webinars. Like yesterday, we had a webinar with researchers, and in that we discuss ABS, TSI, and all of that. And then there will be one for the private sector coming up. The details can be made available. As regards the 3 webinars that are coming up, and the two in December, the notification will go out, I think, later this week, and it will go through the normal channels of the Secretariat, and our industry colleagues Secretariat will actually be sending it forth, and I'm sure UEBT will pick up on that and share it with everybody.
Okay, thank you very much. That's very helpful. Yes, a lot happening now, given indeed that we just celebrated 10 years of the Nagoya Protocol. So many ABS webinars we know are taking place these weeks. Now, coming to you, Suhail, there's a question about the current wording of the, and actually it's a question to you, Suhail, but also maybe to Tauko, with respect to the drafting of the targets and the indicators. Given there was indeed a peer review process to get some feedback on indicators for the various targets. Do you have any idea, and perhaps Tauko, you're in a better position to let us know, when there will be an update provided? And so basically, what is the process from now on for the adoption of the targets, the development of the targets, agreement on the targets, and on the indicators? If you could say a few words about that.
In the roadmap that I gave DSI, it's also addressing the post-2020 framework agenda. Currently, there is a document that has been prepared to further elaborate on the goals and targets. This was supposed then to go to Substan SPI. However, given the challenges that we face of COVID, the date is not yet determined. And regarding the process for on DSI, it's supposed to go, after the RTEC, it's supposed to go to the open-ended working group 3, which will then further elaborate on that. But even that could not be determined because of the current COVID challenge. And so we have opted to keep the momentum by having these 3 information sharing webinars to bring people together to be on the same page as to the substantive issues around DSI and as well as the 2020 targets, and to elucidate the core issues, to keep momentum, and to understand and know what we are talking about. So it's not yet negotiations, but rather just informal consultations for us to be very, very clear, so that when we come to COP and negotiate, we will have a better understanding of what are the issues, and some options and scenarios will be emerging. And we've seen some of them already in some of the webinars, and these will then be collated into one webinar somewhere in the first quarter to draw everything together and say, these are the different options and scenarios from the different stakeholders. And it will be good for the private sector to also engage and see what potential options can come out of that.
Okay, no, thank you very much. So perhaps for our business community participants who may not be so familiar with the process, just to say that basically there are a number of bodies within the CBD that are contributing to the process, but there is a negotiating body that will that continues to negotiate the framework, which is the working group that you were mentioning, the working group on the post-2020 framework, which will meet for the 3rd time in 2021 at a date to be determined, given, as we know, that with the pandemic, it's very difficult to plan face-to-face meetings these days. Okay, so thank you very much. Now I think we will need to move to our next segment. So thank you very much to our two speakers, Tauko and Suhel, for this information on the post-2020 framework. So now we're moving to the second segment. And as part of this second segment, I'm pleased that we have with us today Friedrich Zurheide. He is the coordinator of a GIZ project, which is called Bio-Innovation Africa. This project is broader than ABS, but it has an important ABS component, and it's a project that's underway. So Friedrich will tell us more about this project, and more particularly about what are interesting lessons that can be learned from the implementation of this project that can inform future ABS implementation. So Friedrich, I would ask you to put on your camera and to go ahead with your presentation.
Yes, good afternoon, everybody, dear participants. Thank you very much, Valerie, for the introduction. Now leaving a little bit the political level, but still bearing it in mind. The question is, as we phrased it, how to make it workable. So this is some practitioner's insight. And therefore, I would like to present to you some of the, let's say, initial lessons and approaches of our project in how to address ABS and make it work. And we have just started in last year, so we can call these lessons, of course, preliminary. But first of all, I'd like to, next slide, please, provide a short outline of the project itself, what it is all about. So it aims at developing long-term business partnerships between Africa and Europe for biodiversity-based innovations and products that are based on fair benefit sharing for the conservation, but also the sustainable use of biodiversity, including local development. And it is funded by BMZ, our donor, the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development. And this project is flying under the so-called German Marshall Plan with Africa, which seeks to engage the private sector in development activities. And we have 9 million euros over a period of 3 years until mid-2022. So we do operate in the field of ABS compliant biotrade, and thereby taking into account the UNCTAD biotrade principles as a condition or as a prerequisite for our activities. And as you can see in the slide, we work in 4 African countries: Cameroon, Madagascar, Namibia, and South Africa. And as our political partners, we always work with the relevant institution that has the mandate for the Nagoya Protocol, the CNA. But we are also working closely together as a partner with UEBT to ensure alignment with the UNCTAD biotrade principles and the UEBT standard, and how to better engage with the private sector. But it's also worth mentioning that we have a very strong, close collaboration with the ABS Capacity Development Initiative, which set the base for our project and which supports in particular the political dialogue in the countries. Next slide, please. So to understand our project approach, I would briefly like to introduce the activity fields that we have. With our political partner, in particular, we aim to work on the improvement of the efficiency of the ABS framework in the 4 countries to make it more user-friendly for the so-called users of genetic resources. And thereby, we focus on 3 key activities, including the development of user-friendly and sector-specific manuals on ABS to guide through the permitting process, to strengthen capacities on negotiation and ABS contract development in the 4 countries, and to set up online application systems
that help to facilitate the application procedures as well as the follow-up, the monitoring. Under B, as this is a pilot project, we have to provide proof of concept for the question in how far does the before mentioned benefit sharing really leads to conservation and sustainable use impacts in terms of biodiversity conservation. This is also subject to a study, an international study conducted by PPI, where Rachel Weinberg will provide some further findings after my presentation. Then the core of the project is actually the concrete setup and development of European African partnerships. We have 21 in total to support ethical biotrade. So in other words, to sourcing with respect, and to help navigate through the ABS process and to feed then into component A into the national framework. So A and C are two levels that are supposed to inform each other. Lastly, just to mention, we are also providing a platform for BMZ to promote the subject of biodiversity-based value chains in the wider development arena and in the international context. Next slide, please. So coming to the approaches and preliminary lessons, as I mentioned, we just started last year. So still, I think we can draw some first conclusions and insights. So through the dialogue we had so far with the private sector and with regulators, we learned how important it is to create a better understanding of value chains, of the target markets, so of the utilization as such of the genetic resources, but at the same time also to help the private sector to put themselves in the shoes of the regulator. And since every ABS case is so different, there is a need also to categorize and to set up so-called value chain models that could help to better categorize and identify where ABS is really triggered in each and every case. At the same time, it's important when then coming to the point of setting up benefit sharing arrangements to acknowledge the fact that it differs over time. So if you have an R&D project, benefits are arranged in a different way than if you have already an established supply chain. At the same time, it makes a huge difference whether you have one single provider or it spans geographically over different regions or even countries, and that all has implications for the benefit sharing arrangements. Next one. So one challenge also in achieving robust ABS contracts is the fact that the users and providers and the regulators all have different realities, and there's a need to develop a uniform language and uniform understanding to manage expectations, and therefore we see a need to improve the negotiation skills in the country, so to have agreements that last over years. At the same time, with respect to the online application system, we learned from experiences from Kenya how important that is to start from the onset, having a dialogue by including all public actors that will or may be involved in such a system, because it often spans over sectors and institutions, and to have an early engagement for the buy-in. But in the absence of those digital solutions, it is also important to ensure that there is a physical presence, local representatives of these companies in the country to help navigate through the application process and to facilitate the negotiation. That is a feedback we have often received from the regulators' perspective. So under component C, As I mentioned, the core is to establish partnerships. So what we did in 2019 is following a market-based approach, making a call for expression of interest to collect ideas coming from the private sector. And we finally came up with 21 partnerships in the 4 countries, out of which the majority is actually ABS relevant. And there we have to pilot these cases. What is also worth mentioning, as you can see in the diagram, next please. Yeah, yes, exactly. Which are the key sectors that have submitted or that showed an interest in collaboration and working on. That is the flavor and fragrance industry mostly, but also the cosmetics industry. Whereas we also have partnerships in the field of nutraceuticals and pharmaceutics. As you can also see above, besides the prerequisite of needing to work with a European partner, we learned that there are a good number of African SMEs that partnered with European companies, and that this is a very strong element in the partnership that will help to play a role, and the previously mentioned physical presence in the country to build a bridge. Another finding so far is that in some cases, following a sector-wide approach helped or will help to have economies of scale where scattered sectors, such as in the Buchu sector in South Africa, may help to agree on standards and possibly even sector-wide permits on ABS that are valid for both to save costs. So that is a win-win situation that can be a win-win situation for the private sector and the providers. Next, please. So finally, when looking at the segments of a value chain, as you can see in this illustration, we have identified 6 fields of support that has been expressed and which we will follow throughout the project. So coming to the next one, the next 2 actually. Yeah, there you can see in the field of strengthening the local business, there's a need to improve traceability, working on traceability systems and certification schemes, for example. And then there's a gap in improving sustainable farming wild collection practices. So by introducing and standardizing collection practices such as devil's claw in Namibia, and agreeing on standards such and as well integrating that into management plans of protected areas. Then the support of the ABS compliance, that is something that will go throughout the project to facilitate and navigate through the application and the negotiation process. That is really core. And then in terms of local development and equitable trade, it's about introducing new standards, but also activities, income generating activities that help to create new or improved jobs. And then sector dialogue, as I mentioned, sector-wide approaches play a role, such as for Centella asiatica in Madagascar, to agree on certain sector-wide standards, such as minimum income for the whole sector to agree on and to comply with or to adopt. And finally, matchmaking in the sense of diversifying the portfolio and finding new European clients, and possibly also leading to new products, and sometimes also the support of dossiers to be compliant on the European market that goes even beyond ABS. So in brief, to conclude, ABS plays really a pivotal role in making ethical biotrade a success. But the main challenge is really about how to bridge the worlds and realities to create a shared understanding between the regulators, the private sector, and the providers of biodiversity. And I think that in the coalition, with a coalition of the willing that can spearhead ABS, we could manage to create cases that will inspire others or the sectors to follow. Thank you very much for the attention.
Yes, thank you very much, Frederick. This was very interesting, this presentation. And I think one interesting aspect of it is, of course, it's an illustration of how ABS does not stand alone. And here you have an illustration of ABS being integrated into a broader project dealing with the development of value chains. And there were a number of interesting lessons learned, such as the importance of contract trainings for providers to ensure the level playing field between providers and users in the negotiations of mutually agreed terms, or again, the importance of involving from the start all relevant stakeholders in provider countries. And it's also interesting to note that there are a number of online application permitting systems that are being developed increasingly by a number of countries. So thank you for sharing that with us, Frederick. There will be an opportunity for questions and answers after the next presentation. So I invite participants to post their question and answers in the question and answer box. So now moving to our next presentation, Rachel Weinberg from the University of Cape Town will be presenting. Rachel is working with Sarah Laird as part actually of this Bioinnovation Africa project, looking at what has been the contribution of access and benefit sharing towards conservation and sustainable use so far. And based on their work, Rachel will tell us a bit about what are lessons in terms of how ABS can further contribute in future to conservation and sustainable use. So hopefully she will provide us some answers to that question. So Rachel, if I can invite you to turn your camera on, you can please go ahead with your presentation. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Valerie. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody, and very warm greetings from Cape Town, South Africa. And thanks so much to UEBT for this kind invitation. Sorry we can't be in person. My input today focuses on the way in which ABS has or could support biodiversity conservation. We've heard a lot about the possibilities and the links. And this stems from ongoing research, which we're currently doing to explore what we call the missing link between conservation and ABS. And it's supported in part through the project which Frederick has just described, but it's also been ongoing for the last few years. Next slide, please. So conservation, as we've heard, is often offered as a central argument for the commercial use of biodiversity and genetic resources, and we see this very clearly in the three objectives of the CBD: conservation, sustainable use, and equitable benefit sharing. But what does this actually mean in practice? And it's really important from the start to emphasize that there are different modes of commercializing biodiversity. So biodiscovery, for example, the collection of and research on samples of biological resources to discover genetic information or biochemicals of value, in contrast to biotrade, meaning so the commercial collection, the processing and the sale of products derived from biodiversity, have very, very different relationships to conservation, and therefore they also have very different kinds of benefits. Both of them are linked to the so-called use it or lose it argument from which ABS grew, with this idea that the use of biodiversity can create important incentives for conservation. Biodiversity only very infrequently leads to blockbuster commercial products, and it may also be quite far removed from the original habitats where these resources were collected. So therefore we see that most benefits typically arise in the research phase. For example, there may be partnerships that include capacity building or technology transfer. And in the case of successful commercialization, there might also be royalty payments or milestone payments that could support biodiversity research or might even fund landscape level conservation. Biotrade, in contrast, is typically based on the direct use of one or more multiple species, or of one or multiple species and a particular value chain. So its links to conservation are very, very different to those which I've spoken about for biodiscovery, because they often focus on sustainable harvesting, or, as is common among many ethical trade companies, there might be projects that support communities or particular sort of conservation priorities. Next slide, please. It's useful to think of these benefits in terms of their direct and their indirect impacts on conservation, whether these are monetary or non-monetary. So, for example, there may be a land purchase that's explicitly for conservation, or there may be some kind of plan for sustainable harvesting that's put in place, like we heard for Devil's Claw, or there may be agreements on no-take zones, such as protected areas that might be set aside for biodiversity conservation. Next slide, please. There may also be multiple indirect benefits that are absolutely fundamental for conservation. For example, there may be agreements between research institutions to do really critical biodiversity research that informs conservation management, or that strengthen community-based stewardship and monitoring, or even strengthen land rights, although that doesn't happen very often in our experience, but it's an important possibility. Next slide, please. But despite the opportunities for conservation that I've explained that could arise from these activities, research we've done suggests that actually over the past 30 years since the CBD was adopted, there have been very few conservation benefits that have been realized through ABS. So there are many reasons for this, and we don't believe that a lack of policy is one. In fact, in most countries, the policies and the legal framework are very clearly making this link between conservation and ABS, as does the CBD and the Nagoya Protocol. But in practice, there's just simply very little implementation. We found that there's a lack of specificity in benefit sharing agreements that we've looked at that really describe conservation. That benefits from biotrade are largely tied to sustainable use of a species rather than looking at broader conservation strategies or landscape level interventions. And conservation benefits from biodiscovery have been quite minimal, actually, although there have been some important benefits for research collaborations. In general, and this is, I think, a really important finding, there's been a lack of clarity about the responsibility for initiating and implementing conservation. So, should this be the job of the user or the applicant, or should it be government's task, or should it rest with the provider to put these conservation ideas on the table? No one seems to be taking that responsibility, and therefore not a lot's happening. Sometimes governments may be conflicted about linking conservation to economic development and might even prioritize development or commercial use without creating conservation incentives or without recognizing this inextricable link that there is between local custodians of biodiversity, conservation, and livelihoods. Another problem is that the regulation of the use of traditional knowledge and that of biodiversity or genetic resources is often treated completely separately, and sometimes even by completely different ministries, and that then reduces the connection between biodiversity and its stewardship. Next slide, please. So having said this, it does seem that a number of countries are starting to bring biodiversity much more systematically into benefit sharing. These experiences are still very few, but there are some important lessons emerging of how the situation can be improved. And some of these are pointing to the importance of embedding biodiversity conservation as a very fundamental principle and component of any ABS agreement or approach from the very beginning, from the beginning of negotiations, from the beginning of conceptualizing a project. So the recommendation here is that industry can be proactive in putting biodiversity on the table without necessarily waiting for it to be a requirement from governments, who themselves are struggling, as we know, to put ABS systems in place, let alone to see how conservation can fit in. Many industry associations already build conservation into best practices, and this is obviously an important part of this approach. Another lesson is that decentralizing or localizing conservation benefits is important as far as possible. Many companies are really wary of simply providing money to national trust funds that may not be accountable or transparent. So building relationships with local groups, with conservation agencies, and with communities to support conservation projects is an important alternative. And there's some really interesting models emerging around this approach. I'm sure we might hear from Henry later. In Brazil, a list of projects is prepared for companies that have the option either to invest in those projects or deposit funding into a national fund. And I think that's a really, really interesting approach to look at. At the same time, it's important, it's critically important to not place the burden of implementation on communities who are typically overwhelmed with other priorities. And to recognize that traditional knowledge holders and that resource custodians are often two sides of the same coin. And lastly, there's been over the years an emphasis on monetary benefits, but without necessarily recognizing the importance of non-monetary benefits for conservation. So I've spoken about some of those: research, capacity development, conservation management. And we really need to start thinking out of the box about how to broaden the suite of options that are available to support conservation in ways that are practical, meaningful, and effective. So finally, although ABS can only contribute in a very small way towards resolving the biodiversity crisis that we find ourselves in, it's an important part of the solution. And the private sector has a very critical role to play in many of these actions described, and especially in advocating for a shift towards much greater biodiversity impact through ABS. It obviously can't be done alone. It requires partnerships, it requires collaborations, it requires commitment. Most importantly, it requires new thinking. But now is undoubtedly a good time to start as we start to really grapple with what this post-2020 biodiversity framework looks like and what urgent actions can be implemented to stem the crisis. So thanks very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Rachel. Please keep your camera on. We will also ask Frederick to put his camera on to answer a few questions. So thank you, Rachel. I thought that was very interesting. I think, you know, we often think of the potential contribution of benefit sharing to conservation and sustainable use as through monetary benefits, but it's interesting to see that often it's through non-monetary benefits. In other words, contributing to building awareness through trainings, you know, of sustainable harvesting techniques, of the value of biodiversity. And that is sometimes what has helped to contribute to conservation and sustainable use, noting that much more still needs to be done, and that there is a role for the private sector to perhaps require that there are some specific references to the contribution of benefits shared to conservation and sustainable use, or conservation more specifically in access and benefit sharing agreements. Okay, so now we have received a few interesting questions. The first one is for Frederick. Actually, I have a couple for Frederick. The first one relates to the project, and the fact, well, basically the comment is that the range of products and value chain support is impressive in the Bioinnovation Africa project. But the question is about whether you can share some information on the extent that technology is being transferred through the project.
Mm-hmm. Yes, when the examples I will give is what we have planned, what is formalized, what has been committed by the private sector. But under all these partnerships, we have agreed on a number of development outcomes. So even before having concluded any ABS contract, that is something that they bring in, because we expect the alignment with the UNCTAD Biotrade principles, and those tech transfer, but also knowledge transfer is one of these non-monetary benefits that could be then taken into account. And it is really numerous. Just to give you some examples, and when talking about tech transfer, it always goes along with knowledge transfer. So it's about equipment for example, to conduct R&D. We have a number of R&D projects where there will be mobile distilleries funded, or laboratory equipment and analysis to conduct biochemical analysis, for example, for understanding the properties of active ingredients for the flavor and fragrance industry. And this always goes along with the attempt to institutionalize. So where if feasible, we involve a number of universities to ensure that the knowledge and technology is transferred to a level that can ensure its sustainability. It's about processing equipment from marula oil to meet the standards demanded by the international clients. And often it's joint ventures with companies that have those capacities, and it is not necessarily even capacity coming from Europe, interestingly, but even from within the countries that can provide tech and knowledge transfer from country to country, for example, between South Africa and Namibia. So yeah, and finally, that all aims at creating also competitive advantage for providers with that technology to become more efficient, or to have to ensure a quality that is necessary to be valid on the market.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Frederick. If I may now move on to some questions for Rachel, because we're running out of time for the questions, unfortunately. There's one question to you, Rachel, is whether you could explain a bit more about the reference you made to the separation of TK and genetic resources, so traditional knowledge and genetic resources, which has negatively impacted conservation initiatives. Could you elaborate a bit more on that?
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Valerie. It wasn't necessarily that it's negatively impacted on conservation, but rather that conservation is not included in the overall picture. And I'm talking about particular situations where TK holders have often been dispossessed of their land over centuries through colonization, through, in my country, apartheid policies, so are not necessarily still the custodians of the resources on their land. And what we've seen, certainly in the South African context, is that agreements are negotiated with the rightful traditional knowledge holders, in our case, indigenous San and Khoi, but who are not necessarily custodians of those resources anymore. So it's really important that one is considering the overall picture of conservation, and there isn't, one cannot just assume that by negotiating an agreement with the TK holders that conservation will be addressed. I hope that's clear.
Yes, okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Rachel. Okay, so thank you very much to both of you, Rachel and Frederick, for your presentations and for sharing your experience. Now we will move on to our final segment. And so for this final segment, we have three commenters who will basically share their views on what they perceive to see are key ABS issues for the future, for the business community, and also for countries. So what are these issues that will be on the top of the agenda in the future, post-2020? So I will first ask Daphne Young Dervé, who is a director at the International Chamber of Commerce, to share with us her views and insights. So she's a director at the International Chamber of Commerce and has been following access and benefit sharing for many years, including during the negotiations of the Nagoya Protocol on behalf of the International Chamber of Commerce. So we're very happy to have Daphne with us here today to get some insights from the perspective of the business community. So Daphne, I invite you to turn your camera on and to please go ahead.
Okay. Thank you very much for the introduction, Valérie. And thank you very much also to those who have presented before me. I think they were extremely interesting interventions that will really help inform the debate. The question posed to me was, what are the potential issues for companies, for businesses going forward? I think a lot of this, the response will really depend on what will happen at COP15, because the question is whether the global framework will be used as an opportunity to review the way in which ABS is currently being implemented and try to make it more effective and efficient in achieving the goals of the CBD and other SDGs, or will we carry on as we are now? I think that Rachel has talked about the importance of new thinking, and I think that this is really a chance to have new thinking, because businesses support obviously the principles underlying access and benefit sharing, and companies have been making a lot of efforts to try and reorganize their operations to ensure compliance with ABS regulations. But we also know that there are many, many challenges on the ground relating to the current system: the legal uncertainty, lack of information, administrative burdens and delays, sort of disparate and multiple systems that companies have to deal with. So if the system continues to develop along the same lines, the challenges that companies currently face will multiply as additional countries develop ABS systems. Tauko has mentioned the discussions around DSI, and if the DSI is then the current system is then expanded to include yet another element without having really investigated the impact of that, this will probably this will definitely make it much, much more difficult for companies to work with genetic resources. However, if the post-2020 framework is really used as an opportunity to take a step back and look at lessons learned, this could result in a change of approach, which could really help make the system more effective, and both for companies in creating a value from genetic resources and researchers, etc., and then having that value shared with the providers of genetic resources. So we need to try and build a system that will encourage the creation of value for all stakeholders, and that will also create value for achieving the objectives of the CBD, as well as the SDGs. Friedrich has mentioned, for instance, in the Bio-Innovation Africa, that some countries have it, for countries it's very important to create value in building up the bioeconomy and biotrade. Rachel has also mentioned the value from the use of genetic resources for conservation. which has not maybe been brought up as much as it should have been till now in the system. To do this, we need to have systems that not only create the legal certainty and reduce the transaction costs, but businesses need to be able to really innovate and create value, but also systems that better reflect the reality of how research and development and business supply chains work. Rachel mentioned another very important element that will help engage companies, which is to make the link much clearer to conservation and other SDG goals. I think she had very interesting recommendations on how to embed this aspect into ABS systems. We also have to, I think, recall that many users, in most cases, the users will not be implementing or in contact with the providers on the ground, but will be much higher up in the supply chain. So we need to also to see how that would work. Sustainability is very important to companies nowadays, and biodiversity is going up the corporate sustainability agenda. And I think ABS will be much more meaningful for companies if they can understand and demonstrate and communicate how ABS contributes to sustainable use and conservation. Just one very last point is that Tauco mentioned the importance of private sector engagement. I think the positive thing about ABS is that the mechanism has helped bring different actors together. And it's very important, I think, for all actors and especially the users to come together and really input into how a future system can be developed that will work for everybody, and also to create trust. Thank you very much, Valerie.
Sorry, I forgot to unmute. Thank you very much, Daphne, and thank you for that that last word about building trust. I think that's a key point. And of course, there has been a lot of developments, progress towards implementation of ABS over the years, but as we know, there is still a lot to be done, and learning by doing also. And of course, some controversial issues to be addressed, such as digital sequence information. Now I would like to turn to Sasha Lise. Sasha is Manager Corporate Sustainability at Symrise. So we're very happy to have him with us today to provide us a very concrete view, given he is actually working on ABS on a daily basis for Symrise, finding solutions, accessing, sourcing raw material in countries. So Sasha, can you tell us what you see as key issues on ABS to be addressed post-2020, and perhaps already a bit about what you are doing on integrating ABS at the company level?
Yes, with pleasure. And thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to provide a little bit the practitioner's perspective. I think today we have seen many presentations which have shown that ABS is a very holistic topic going into multiple directions, touching many topics relevant to companies. And as a practitioner who started at Symrise 5 years ago, it was already clear at that time that ABS is and will be increasingly become an important topic to our company. And before I look into the future, just a short look back into the past. So what did we do in the past years? We have set up ABS management system, including policies, procedures, work instructions, guidelines for our staff in order to enable them to comply with the new requirements we are facing. Of course, raw material traceability, as previously mentioned, is absolutely key. You need to know the flow of your raw materials. You need to know the origin of your raw materials in order to identify the right law to take into account. Of course, ABS is also about not only understanding the specific requirements of a local law, but also understanding what your corporate activities mean in light of local law. And here I think from a company perspective, dialogue between regulators and companies is really key also for the future. In the past, it was also very much about awareness raising, not only internally within our company to explain that ABS in the Nagoya Protocol is really important and matters to us, but also to our business ecosystem. This especially relates to our suppliers, where we need to work hard to convince them to provide many data which they are not used to provide to their customers in order to enable us to manage ABS properly. And at the customer side, we are meanwhile increasingly facing many requests asking us if the raw materials we use or the products we sell are affected by ABS and in how far they are in compliance. And thanks to the fact that we started to work very early on ABS, we are now in a position to deliver. If we would have started today, the exercise would have become really challenging. When I look into our markets, I would say that, as indicated previously, the awareness for ABS is increasing, but the question is this really sufficient? Among our suppliers and customers, we see very committed companies, fully aware of what is going on, very hardly engaged to comply with ABS, but there are also some laggards. And if I speak to civil society people or representatives from authorities, I usually regularly get the feedback that business could or should engage a little bit more in order to make ABS a success. And now I'm coming to my perspective on the future. So when we look at ABS and on the perceptions of the many actors, my personal perception is that ABS is still perceived foremost as a compliance issue, which it is, of course, but I think it is definitely more than that. And as a company who is active in markets where product sustainability stories and claims and value propositions are becoming increasingly important, especially for sustainability conscious customers, I'm really wondering if we all should not more focus on the opportunity side of ABS. I mean, complying with ABS means that you automatically do something good for people, for nature, in the various provider countries of your raw materials. And although I'm not a marketing person, I'm deeply convinced that this is exactly what the customers of today want to know when purchasing products of different kinds. And if we come, if we change a little bit our mindset, and this is something which Rach mentioned, we need a new thinking on ABS. If we change our mindset away from compliance towards sustainability, then I think the global implementation of ABS will become easier for all actors involved, and maybe also becoming a little bit self-perpetuating, because you identify that doing ABS can provide value to your business, to your product, and finally to global consumers. Of course, the point of legal certainty is another issue, but I think this has been mentioned extensively, and I don't want to go into detail on that. So, key message would be: keep compliance in mind, focus on the ABS opportunities, be aware that it could be a force for good, and maybe this will increase dynamic of global ABS implementation. Back to you, Valerie.
Thank you very much, Sasha. Yes, and thank you for sharing these positive thoughts. And as you say, I think ABS increasingly is becoming part of sustainable practices, of course, as we see at UEBT. And so there is more room for that in looking at ABS in a broader context beyond compliance. So thank you for pointing this out. Now I would like to move to our last commenter. Our last commenter is Henry Denovion. He is an ABS expert. He has worked for many years with the Brazilian government on access and benefit sharing, and he is now working with the ABS Capacity Development Initiative. So Henry, based on his experience at the country level, will share with us some thoughts in terms of what are key issues for countries on ABS post-2020. So Henry, I would ask you to please turn on your video and go ahead.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Valerie, and thank you for having me and for the opportunity to share my views on emerging ABS issues. Sorry, I think it's, okay. Well, first of all, happy anniversary to the Nagoya Protocol. We should always recall that the Nagoya Protocol was meant to contribute to building trust and legal certainty in ABS. We should also recall that ABS is a powerful reconciliation tool that requires requires trust for its fulfillment. We need to be creative and daring to use ABS, and thus further develop and implement ABS to an instrument that really contributes to conservation and sustainable use, not just in terms of resource mobilization, but also with smart cooperation approaches, know-how, and technology transfer from which users and providers will benefit. Although we can't predict future, for sure we can affirm that without trust, we won't have an efficient and fair global ABS system. But I am optimistic that we, as the ABS community, we have the tools to do a transformational change and overcome the lack of trust embedded in ABS agenda. I believe there are three complementary ways to achieve this. First, users would have an increased trust to invest in bioproducts if national ABS measures had preset terms and conditions, and if they also had predefined mutually agreed terms with preset benefit sharing conditions. Instead of implementing ABS measures with overly bureaucratic requirements, with pick and met negotiation on a case-by-case basis, regulating on the basis of expectations of what may be potential outcomes, we should focus on regulating results and outcomes, such as publications of research results and commercialization of products based on genetic resources. By providing a predefined MET with preset benefit sharing conditions, including with different benefit sharing models according to sectors, the user is able to foresee the consequences of its activities and the requirements to be complied with. From my experience with the Brazilian ABS legislation, I can affirm that when terms and conditions are publicly available beforehand, clarity and effectiveness are enhanced. Users and providers' transaction costs are reduced, since there is no need to negotiate every asset and use. But most importantly, the level of legal certainty and predictability is higher, and thus the expected trust to invest in the development of bio-based products materializes itself. Secondly, support to indigenous peoples and local communities on the development of their community protocols will contribute to building trust between providers and users. All stakeholders should promote or directly contribute to the development of community protocols by IOCs focused on ABS issues. Community protocols set out how IOCs expect other stakeholders to engage with them, providing a certain set of standards to be observed, thus helping other stakeholders to better understand the community's values, terms, and conditions. The development of a community protocol contributes to increase IOC's trust in ABS, since they will probably feel more confident in granting PIC and celebrating MET when based on their own community protocols, terms, and conditions. At the same time, it allows users to foresee IOC values, conditions, and aspirations beforehand, what also generates predictability, certainty, and trust on the user side. And finally, the third issue, which is subject of distrust, is the debate on digital sequence information. DSI is a concrete ABS issue and will be for a while. And building trust in addressing this issue is possible as much as it is imperative. In the absence of an international agreed solution on DSI, countries are already implementing their own rules for the use of DSI, what may lead us ending up with a plethora of models that inevitably will increase transaction costs, uncertainty, and mistrust. But if we are to build trust, we should consider to explore the idea of establishing a global multilateral benefit sharing mechanism for DSI, as the one referred to in the Nagoya Protocol. A clearly multilateral benefit sharing mechanism for DSI would allow for gaining experience, while it could also contribute in situations where the bilateral approach does not deliver, such as transboundary resources, unclear traditional knowledge, ex situ and in situ collections, and biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction. A transformational change is also needed here to build required trust in order to keep DSI utilizations open, but under terms and conditions that allow monetary benefits to be fairly shared. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Henry. Thank you for sharing your thoughts. I would invite Henry, Sasha, and Daphne to turn on their cameras and to see if we have any questions. So thank you very much to the three of you. It was interesting that one that I think two of you at least mentioned the issue of trust as being a key issue going forward. And of course, for those who were involved in the negotiations of the protocol, they will remember that building trust was a major objective of the protocol. And of course, more work still needs to be done for users and providers to understand themselves, to be speaking the same language. But it is very nice to see that now access and benefit sharing is becoming part of sustainable practices, that sustainability is becoming really an issue at the level of companies. And we're talking hearing a lot about sustainability over the past month. So that's very positive, and more also talk about biodiversity. So we have a question here. So first of all, we have a question to you, Sasha, is about benefit sharing projects with traditional communities, and whether your customers, or basically you are open to benefit sharing projects with traditional communities, or whether you prefer simply monetary benefits, sharing monetary benefits. I don't know if it's possible for you to give us an idea of how basically you feel it's useful to share benefits with provider countries. What is the most effective way of doing it?
From a Symrise perspective, or from a customer's perspective?
Well, it says from a customer's perspective.
Okay. Yeah, this question is hard to answer because we really have many customers. It's a couple of thousand. So there's no standard answer for this. What to
interrupt you, Sasha, but perhaps you can tell us on behalf, rather from Symrise's perspective, what works best for you, and what it is you are doing in terms of sharing benefits.
Yeah. So Symrise is conducting many supply chain projects which take ABS into account a little bit more accidentally. So we are conducting many supply chain products for natural resources where we do implement activities which are listed in the so-called Bonn guidelines on ABS, but usually without being legally obliged to do so. This is just a matter of fact that we think it's a good idea to invest into our strategic value chains. When it comes to benefit sharing from a customer's perspective, as I said, no standard answer. So if you are a company with this regulatory mindset and perspective on ABS, maybe it's a good idea to just share monetary benefit and then things are done. If you are interested to bring positive impact to your products and provide purpose to your products, then I think it's a good idea to directly engage with traditional knowledge holders, with local communities, directly engage on the ground for biodiversity, because I think this is the models which would allow you to draw a connection between a final product and the very source of the raw materials or the inspiration of the product. And this is exactly what we want to do. So we would like to investigate if there is interest among our customers to engage in these kind of projects, if there is an interest to bring biodiversity, traditional knowledge and relating stories to consumer goods products. And if this is the case, we are happy to support our clients on this journey.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sasha. And perhaps a final question, because unfortunately we're running out of time. And this question is for you, Henry. And it is about how you think that countries now are perceiving the private sector after 10 years of dialogue. So how has the relationship basically between countries and the private sector evolved over this period?
Well, I can speak as from the Brazilian perspective. It was very important, the transition that we had in our ABS legislation, because the first legislation was actually set up without the participation of the private sector, and the second one was almost negotiated with them. And that was important for the officials of the government to see how important for them was to be part of this process of generating values and products from the biodiversity, and also to contribute to foster the conservation of biodiversity through these activities. And in Brazil, we have a very strong private sector investing in biodiversity. And I believe that once we have legislations that allow this kind of activities to materialize, we'll be able to see more and more companies being a part of the solution, part of creating means to promote the biodiversity conservation. So I believe that engagement of companies is imperative to be able to have an efficient ABS global system.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much, Henry. And now, unfortunately, we have to close the webinar in a minute. But Daphne, would you like to say some final words before we wrap up?
Yes, thank you, Valerie. I just want to pick up on what Sasha said about the importance of seeing ABS as an opportunity, and also we can also see this post-2020 and the 10 years of Nagoya as an opportunity to learn from lessons. And from the lessons, for instance, that Henry mentioned in working, all the stakeholders working together, which ABS, I think that's a very positive result of ABS, that stakeholders are working much more together, and to use the opportunity to find common goals and common concepts of value that we want to create. Conservation, but also possibly other things that countries and users and all stakeholders will find valuable for society. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, thank you for sharing this food for thought, indeed. What more do we want out of ABS in the future? So I wish to thank you very much for sharing your experience, your views. And now, unfortunately, we need to wrap up. So it's almost the end of this webinar. So I would invite you to please shut your cameras. So basically now, well, this was the last ABS webinar for this year, but we are still planning to have some discussions on ABS next year. And if you have any particular ideas, topics you would like to discuss, we are welcome to that. So please do not hesitate and share with us any ideas on topics you would like to see addressed by UEBT in 2021. Essentially, UEBT will continue to follow developments at the international level to ensure that the business perspective can be taken into account. We also, of course, continue to work very closely with our members and other companies to support ABS implementation. You see on the screen now the upcoming webinars as part of our digital dialogue series. So there is an upcoming webinar on the 12th of November, Taking Action for Biodiversity, which is followed by a webinar on the 19th of November on ethical sourcing and due diligence program. And on the 24th, we will have our leaders roundtable. So I invite you to join us for these upcoming webinars at UEBT. And I thank you again very much for joining us. If you have any comments, any suggestions for future discussions on ABS, please do not hesitate to write to me at valerie@ethicalbiotrade.org. And again, thank you very much to our sponsors and to our speakers and commenters today. So thank you very much and have a nice rest of the day.